Insulin is the bad guy. I can't say it any simpler than that. Yes, glucose is bad too. I'm not saying it's not. Insulin's worse. Insulin is associated with all of the diseases of metabolic syndrome. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia. And why are we insulin resistant? Because our mitochondria are screwed. Mitochondria are fat. So the lower the fat that you're eating, the less well your mitochondria would work. Actually cause the insulin resistance. This concept of calories is useless. It's essentially garbage. Calories come from bomb calorimeters. Our mitochondria are not bomb calorimeters. So there's leptin deficiency, there's leptin resistance. Ultimately, the brain sees the same thing, not enough leptin. But leptin deficiency is a total of 14 people in the world. Leptin resistance is about 4 billion people. 14 people, 4 billion people. Which do you think you have? You gotta fix the leptin resistance. So what causes the leptin resistance?
Rob, why is excess insulin a problem? And how much is too much?
Why is excess insulin a problem? So let's talk about what insulin is. Insulin is a hormone. It's made in one place, works in another. It's made by the beta cells of the pancreas, works on not quite every cell, but almost every cell on the body. Now, for years, we thought that insulin only had one job, and that was to deposit glucose into cells. Okay? That is true, but it's way more than that. And what it really is it deposits glucose and fatty acids into different types of cells. And in the process, causes energy storage. So it basically takes energy away from the mitochondria that would burn it and puts it in places where the mitochondria can't necessarily get to it. And the reason is because mitochondria are like funnels. And you can basically fill a funnel slowly, in which case the funnel will be able to direct the flow of the fluid into the bottle you're trying to funnel it into. But if you overstuff that funnel and basically provide the liquid or even the solid too fast, what will happen is you'll get it all over the place. And ultimately, your mitochondria can only take energy at a certain rate. And so insulin is the way to divert energy away from the mitochondria. So the higher your insulin goes, the more that's telling you that the mitochondria are overwhelmed. And when your mitochondria are overwhelmed, that causes them to be dysfunctional. And the extra substrate is going to go into another storage form of chemical energy, which is not necessarily good for you, in the form of liver fat or, peripheral fat. And so high insulin means energy storage rather than energy burning. And what you want to be doing is energy burning. So high insulin is a bad guy in the story. High insulin is associated with all of the diseases of metabolic syndrome. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease. All 8 of those diseases are associated with high insulin, i.e. insulin resistance, that your insulin's not doing its job. And the reason is because your mitochondria are not doing their job. And that's why your insulin had to go up.
Okay, so the very top of this chain is mitochondria becoming overwhelmed, too much energy. Let's talk about how they signal to the body they don't want anymore and how that leads to more insulin.
Well, I don't think we know how they do that yet. We have some, interesting clues to it, though. When your mitochondria are in distress, they send out distress signals. And those distress signals include mitochondrial DNA. So you can find mitochondrial DNA as a sign of mitochondrial shall we say, exhaustion, and also extracellular ATP. And that also is a sign that your cells are on its last legs. It's kind of an agonal event. And it basically tells the body, I'm in trouble and it's time for inflammation to help clean up the mess. So this is work from Dr. Bob Navio at University of California, San Diego, who basically looks at mitochondrial function and this concept of salutogenesis, which is the concept of healing, and how the mitochondria are hooked to this concept of healing. And it turns out that, when your mitochondria are not happy, they tell you.
Okay, so I'm just trying to piece this together. We have too much glucose in the system.
Or fructose in the system.
So either way, with either one of those substrates, is insulin bringing that into the cell to a point until the mitochondria say no more?
Well, no, what's doing is insulin's diverting it away from those cells so that the mitochondria have a chance to basically burn it all the way through.
But doesn't the glucose need the insulin to get into the cell?
Yes, that's the problem. That is the problem. Certain cells need insulin for glucose to get into the cell. So which cells need glucose to get into the cell? Okay. The liver and the fat tissue. Now, the muscle does not need glucose to get into the cell, because if muscle needed insulin to get glucose into the cell, then every type 1 diabetic would be paralyzed. Now, insulin does have effects on the muscle, no question, but it's not for glucose. It's for amino acids. So insulin is necessary to get amino acids into the muscle cell, and that's for growth, in order to increase muscle size, muscle mass. You need those amino acids to make the actin and the myosin that basically make the muscle fibers. So insulin is very important for muscle growth, but it is not necessary for muscle burning.
Okay, let's take another cell besides muscle. So insulin's needed to get that glucose into the cell. Mitochondria become overwhelmed.
Let's take brain as an example. There's insulin made in the brain. There are insulin receptors in the brain. So your brain must need insulin, right? On the other hand, if you have no insulin, your brain still works fine. Okay? As type 1 diabetics, they're not unconscious. They're not comatose. Okay? In fact, glucose gets into neurons without insulin. And the reason is because insulin affects really only two glucose transporters, GLUT2 and GLUT4. Okay, GLUT5 is the fructose transporter. GLUT3 is insulin independent, and GLUT1 is insulin independent. GLUT1 is the one that's in the brain. So in fact, your brain does not need insulin to get the glucose into the brain. It goes in anyway. So what's insulin doing in the brain? Why are there insulin receptors in the brain? And are there insulin receptors on all brain cells? No. Where are the insulin receptors? They're in the hypothalamus. They're in the ventral tegmental area. They're in areas that are related to food intake. So insulin is a driver of food metabolism. When your insulin is working right in your brain, it's one of the signals that tells you, hey, I'm in the middle of metabolizing a meal. Cut it out. Don't eat any more. So it's part of the acute satiety response. But it's not forcing glucose into cells like it is in, say, the liver or the muscle or the fat.
All right, well, let's take fat, for example, here. We'll leave the brain aside too, muscle aside. I just want to try and get most upstream to understand the fundamentals here, where, in my understanding, insulin comes in, allows that glucose to get into the cell, and then it's going to go to the mitochondria. But then I want to tie this back to what we said before about the mitochondria becoming overwhelmed. Then it's going to signal, we're not exactly sure how, that we have enough energy here. I'll have you take
What
it.
the insulin did was it forced the glucose into the cell, but it didn't necessarily say, go to the mitochondria. It might be going to fat for storage. It's basically taking the weight of what you're bringing in and diverting it away from the mitochondria so that the mitochondria don't get even more dysfunctional than they already are. So insulin's driving energy away from mitochondria, not toward mitochondria. So it's going into cells, but it's not going toward mitochondria.
Okay, so what takes it from somewhere in the cell to the mitochondria?
The lack of insulin. So the first step is glucose has to be converted to pyruvate, and that is the process called glycolysis. So that generates a little bit of ATP. There is a glucose. There's an enzyme that increases glucose uptake into cells. That enzyme is called PI3 kinase, phosphatidylinositol 3 kinase. This is the enzyme that Lou Cantley, first at Harvard and then at Cornell, discovered and showed that this is the primary way that cancer cells snarf up glucose, is that their PI3 kinase is turned on way high. And they'll grab all the glucose they can, irrespective of the insulin level. Okay. And so it's not necessarily insulin dependent. The PI3 kinase will grab and snarf whatever glucose is floating by. And the more PI3 kinase that's activated, the more glucose will enter the cell, because cancer cells need lots and lots of glucose, because cancer cells don't have functional mitochondria. They ferment to make their ATP. They don't burn it in mitochondria to make their ATP. So cancer cells, and also fetal cells, by the way, during pregnancy, same thing. You need ATP, but you don't necessarily need insulin to generate it. So insulin will come in. Glucose will come in. Insulin basically tells the cell, don't send it to mitochondria, send it to storage. Insulin is the energy storage hormone. More insulin, more energy stored, either as glycogen in the liver and as fat everywhere else.
Okay, let's talk about our fat cell here. Somebody consuming too much sugar, too many carbs, blood sugar goes up, insulin goes up, the fat cell's getting this glucose deposited within it.
Fatty acids, right?
Okay, explain that part, the fatty acid on top of that.
So the fatty acids will be in the LDL or in the VLDL, the triglyceride, either or. And the glucose will be, on its own, glucose circulating. And the insulin will stimulate the GLUT4 transporter for glucose to get across into the fat cell. And then that glucose can be turned into triglyceride in the fat cell to increase fat stores. In addition, the insulin will stimulate another enzyme on the fat cell called lipoprotein lipase. And that enzyme will snarf and soak up and suck up circulating lipid off LDL and VLDL and throw it into the cell, where it then gets turned into triglyceride as well. So you have two different transport mechanisms in the fat cell, and both are insulin driven. The GLUT4 transporter is insulin driven, and lipoprotein lipase is insulin driven. The GLUT4 transporter is for the glucose. The lipoprotein lipase is for the fat. Either way, you're making more fat. So insulin's really good at making fat.
Well, let's take this story even further. Somebody's doing this over a long period of time. Fat cells are continuing to get bigger and bigger. that is the body's natural way of storing energy, when does that become problematic?
Right. So how much fat is too much fat? That's the question you're asking. Well, first, remember that there are 3 fat depots in the body. Okay, the fat depot that you're thinking about right now, and that we'll talk about this moment, is the subcutaneous or big butt fat. But there are 2 other fat depots that we have to deal with, and we'll do that after. Okay, the other 2 are the visceral fat or the big belly fat, and also the liver fat. So we have big butt fat, big belly fat, and liver fat, and they're not all the same. They have different qualities, they have different regulatory mechanisms, they have different stimuli, and they have different blood supplies, and they all do different things for your body or against your body.
Before you get into this, let me set the scene. We're taking in too much energy. The body's storing fat. You've talked about these 3 different areas that it can go into. Does it go into one before the others?
Which fat depot it goes into depends on the metabolic status of the individual at the time the fat came in, that the energy came in. So I can't answer that question because everybody's different at different times of the day and at different points in their life. And it's much more complicated than one takes precedence over the other. Now, if you are insulin sensitive, the preferential storage place will be the subcutaneous or big butt fat. So in an insulin sensitive person, subcutaneous fat will get the energy first. Okay. Now, how much fat can you gain before your subcutaneous fat becomes a problem? There is a limit. Everyone has a limit. And once you go above that limit, then you start getting into problems. On average, about 10 kilos, 22 pounds. So most people, when they're insulin sensitive, can gain 22 pounds and show no signs of metabolic mayhem. But at a certain point, you reach an asymptote, a peak. And at that peak, things then start to decompensate. So why do they decompensate? Your fat cells snarfing fat or glucose into the fat cell and building fat. And the fat droplet, the fat vacuole, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so your fat grows. Your fat cells don't grow. Okay, your fat cells don't multiply, they grow. Okay, you don't make more fat cells, you grow the fat cells you have. So the fat vacuole in each fat cell gets bigger and bigger. And at a certain point, the perilipin border that circles that fat vacuole where the fat's been placed can't stretch wide enough. Kind of like a balloon. Okay, every balloon has a point at which it can't hold the air anymore, and it bursts. Well, kind of like that for a fat vacuole. You put so much in, you put so much in, you put so much in, it gets bigger, 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 and finally, the perilipin border can't hold it all. And when that happens, it starts leaking. And then the fat that should be in the fat vacuole now ends up in the cytoplasm of that cell. And that chokes off the cell. And now that cell will die. You have killed that fat cell. Well, now you have basically a grease problem. Okay, you got to clear the grease. Okay, so what do? You recruit that dead fat cell with all those, with all those fatty acids that have now spilled out and have killed that cell. Okay, that has to ultimately be, you have to call in the cleanup crew. And that's the macrophages. And so that recruits the macrophages to come and chew up all that grease and, get it out of the body. Okay. In the process, those macrophages secretes cytokines, which basically bring more macrophages. And so now you've got a whole inflammatory process going on. And then those macrophages, those cytokines end up in the bloodstream. And the level of the cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6 will go up. The question is, do they go up to the point where they start affecting other organs? And the answer is, it depends on how much fat you're dealing with. And it also depends on the volume of distribution of the liquid, which happens in this case to be blood. So the volume of distribution of the peripheral, blood system of your body, which is, basically, all the blood, is 6 liters. Okay, so you're basically increasing protein concentrations, these inflammatory proteins in the blood, and you're putting it into a 6-liter volume. Well, 6 liters is a lot of blood. And so you have to generate a huge increase in those cytokines before it will reach a concentration that will ultimately affect the liver or affect the brain or affect some other part of the body in a negative fashion. So, in general, your subcutaneous fat can expand by about 10 kilos before the amount of cytokines that are generated by those, dying fat cells reach a point that it causes metabolic mayhem. Okay? That's where your body wants to put the fat, put the extra energy. Now, there are 2 other places. There's the visceral fat and there's the liver fat. So let's talk about each one of those separately now. Visceral fat. What drives visceral fat accumulation? What drives big belly fat accumulation? Answer: not calories. The answer is cortisol. Now, how do we know that? Okay, because in general, big belly fat goes up when big butt fat goes up too. They go up together. Okay, it's rare for one to be separate from the other, but it happens, and that's the key. Is when does it happen that the big belly fat goes up and the big butt fat goes down? And the answer is depression. Depression, major depressive disorder. So there are patients who are admitted to the hospital to keep themselves from themselves. Okay, they are suicidal. They are major depressive disorder. Life has lost all meaning and they want to die. Okay, and we have to admit them to the hospital, emergently usually, to basically prevent suicide. You take those people, they're not eating. They're anhedonic. They derive no pleasure from food. They are losing weight. Major depressive disorder results in weight loss. It's one of the questions on the Beck Depression Inventory. Do you have weight loss? And the reason is because people who are depressed don't eat. They're losing weight. But you stick them in a scanner, and it turns out their visceral fat's going up. At the same time, their subcutaneous fat is going down. So if visceral fat were due to food, that wouldn't be happening. Visceral fat is due to cortisol. Cortisol increases visceral fat accumulation. And anything that increases your stress is going to increase your visceral fat. Why does this happen? Because your visceral fat is much easier to lift the fat out of than the subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous fat is kind of stuck there. It's very hard to lift it out. That's why women find it so hard to lose that big butt even when they're dieting. Okay? They'll lose it from their belly, but they won't lose it from their butt, because subcutaneous fat is much harder to fish it out. Metabolically active fat is the visceral fat. And so when you're in a stress situation, that's your go-to in terms of getting energy, is the visceral fat. And the reason is because the visceral fat drains directly into the liver, drains through the portal vein. Remember we talked about the volume of distribution being 6 liters for the subcutaneous fat? Well, for visceral fat, the volume of distribution is about 250 cc's, quarter of a liter. So 6 liters, a quarter of a liter, 24 times the concentration. So when you start accumulating visceral fat, those cytokines come, and they're releasing those cytokines into the portal circulation, and the concentration is 24 times greater because the volume of distribution of the portal system is way smaller than the volume of the general systemic circulation. And that means that your liver and your brain are going to see higher levels of cytokines for a smaller amount of fat that's been accumulated. And so visceral fat is much more potent as a driver of metabolic disease than is subcutaneous fat. Visceral fat is a much bigger problem. And that's why stress is such an issue in our society, because it's generating visceral fat. And then finally, we have number 3, liver fat. Now, liver fat, what makes liver fat? 2 things: sugar and alcohol. Sugar and alcohol make liver fat. Does dietary fat make liver fat? Nah. What about other foods? Branched chain amino acids can make liver fat too. So leucine, isoleucine, valine. So shall we say low quality protein. Branched chain amino acids, like what is in protein powder. So you need those to make muscle, but when you're not making muscle, then those end up becoming liver fat. Chris Newgard at Duke University demonstrated this very nicely, is that branched chain amino acids are part of the problem of liver fat. So what makes liver fat? Fructose, alcohol, and branched chain amino acids. You know what that's called? That's called ultra-processed food. So ultra-processed food drives calories, therefore subcutaneous fat. Okay. Does it drive visceral fat? Not specifically, except that people who are stressed often try to find solace in their stress by eating ultra-processed food. So it becomes an indirect driver because of the cortisol, which increases your appetite. And then finally, it generates liver fat directly. Now, how many kilos or pounds of liver fat can you store before you see metabolic mayhem?
I would be guessing. I'll say 1/4 pound.
Half a pound. Okay, 1/4 kilo, half a pound. So 22 pounds of subcutaneous fat equals about 4 pounds of visceral fat equals about half a pound of liver fat in terms of causing problems, causing metabolic problems. So which is the worst?
Sounds like liver.
Liver fat's the worst. And what makes liver fat? Ultra-processed food.
And alcohol.
And alcohol. Well, that's ultra-processed. Okay, so it depends on which fat depot, it depends on what the driver is, and it depends on your metabolic status when it happens. So not a simple calculus. It's not something where you say, oh, this, then that. You have to know who the patient is, and that will tell you where the fat's going to go.
All right, that was brilliant. I want to follow up in a lot of different areas here. Starting with visceral fat. So we know cortisol is the root cause there. But if somebody is taking in a lot of carbs, a lot of sugar, is there some overspill from subcutaneous fat? Now, I shouldn't say overfill because that's 2 different systems, but if the body's overwhelmed, can that build up with an abundance of energy as well, secondarily?
Oh, absolutely, because insulin will drive energy into visceral fat. But cortisol is the big driver. But remember, when you have high cortisol, you're going to eat a lot. That's what happens in Cushing's syndrome. Okay, Cushing's syndrome is hypercortisolism, and you end up with this enormous big belly. You end up with muscle wasting. You end up with thin arms and legs, but you end up with this huge big belly. And the reason is because the cortisol directed all the fat, all the energy to the visceral fat.
Okay, earlier you mentioned the fact that our fat cells with the subcutaneous, they don't actually multiply, they just grow in size. Isn't there some of multiplication? Yeah, explain that.
They multiply till age 2.
Okay, so no multiplying once you're an adult.
Yeah, well, right. Basically, you're done. Now, having said that, fat cells don't multiply, but there are things called preadipocytes. Now, they look like fibroblasts, but they're preadipocytes. And in response to insulin and cortisol, those preadipocytes can turn into fat cells. So in that way, you can grow your fat. But it's not because they divided. They're already there. They're just kind of stringy little wispy things until they get hit with the hormones that basically get them to, finish their differentiation. And then so they can become fat cells. But there's no cell division that goes on past age 2. So they're kind of like adipocytes in abeyance. They're kind of like, emergency adipocytes, but they're there. They're just not dividing. They're waiting to be ballooned up by the right hormonal environment. Kind of like having a spare tire that doesn't have any air in it. It's there. God forbid you should need it, but you got to put some air in it for it to work.
Let's zoom back and talk about our thesis as a whole. So we're having too many carbohydrates, too many sugars, we're raising insulin. You talked about the chronic diseases associated with that throughout the body, but let's get into physiology-wise, what's actually happening there.
Every cell in your body has a point in time in its life when it wants to grow, and every cell in your body has a point in time when it wants to burn. Growth, burn, growth, burn. Now, the substrate for both is glucose. Glucose causes growth, glucose causes burning. That's true. But there's a switch in the cell that determines, am I going to grow or am I going to burn? Now, let's do a little thought experiment. Each of us starts out as one cell, a zygote. Okay? Sperm and egg meet, you get a zygote, one cell. Now, that one cell becomes 2. Those 2 cells become 4. 4 cells become 8. Okay? 8 cells become 16. Okay? You're starting to get to an embryo, right? And there's a doubling and a doubling and a doubling and a doubling. And you end up with a baby. And then that baby has to then become an adult. Okay, so you start out with one cell, and that has to become an adult of 10 trillion cells. So you go from one cell to 10 trillion cells. How many doublings does it take to get from one cell to 10 trillion cells?
Probably less than we think, because when we start getting up there,
it's an exponent. So it's 2 to the what equals 10 trillion.
I don't know. I'm just assuming it's like the penny doubling thing where it seems like it's nothing. And then eventually it's just like flips on a dime. I'm assuming a similar kind of thing.
So how many is it, Jesse?
Okay, I'll say 35.
You're not too bad. Way closer than most people. 41. 2 to the 41 doublings gets you to be an adult. You go from zygote to adult. 41 doublings. Now, some of those will have occurred in utero, and some of those will have occurred after birth. Now, how many of the doublings occurred in utero, and how many of the doublings occurred after birth? So I need two numbers that add up to 41.
Okay, I'll say 39 and 2.
Not quite, but you got the right idea. Okay, it's 36 and 5. So 2 to the 36 gets you to a newborn, and then the last 5 get you to an adult. People freak out when you think about that, but I mean, I'll do it for you. Okay, standard baby, 7 pounds. Okay, first doubling, 14 pounds. Second doubling, 28 pounds. Third doubling, 56 pounds. Fourth doubling, 112 pounds. Fifth doubling, 224 pounds. So, adult with metabolic syndrome. Okay, so 2 to the 41, 36 in utero, and 5 after birth. Kind of cool, huh? When you think about it. So there has to be a method for the body to use to go from growth in utero to slowing down growth and ultimately burning as an adult. How does that happen? And the answer is a whole bunch of hormones. Okay? But ultimately, there are 3 enzymes in each cell that determine which way the glucose goes. And those 3 enzymes, we mentioned one of them before, PI3 kinase. That's the spigot that lets the glucose in. The second one's called AMP kinase. That's the fuel gauge on the cell to tell it whether or not it needs to burn because ATP is running out. And if ATP is not running out, then you won't send it, and you might send it to growth instead, the glucose. And then the last one is called mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin. And what that enzyme does, it determines whether the cell's ready to divide. So if your cell is in burning mode, your PI3 kinase is low, your AMP kinase is high, and your mTOR is low. Conversely, if you're in growth mode, then it's the opposite. Your PI3 kinase is high, your AMP kinase is low, and your mTOR is high. So you have burning, you have growth. And those 3 enzymes determine which way the glucose is going to go. Is it going to growth or is it going to burning? Okay? And it can't do both. It's got to do one or the other. Okay, think of it like a cord of wood. Okay, you can do 2 things with the cord of wood. You can burn it in a fireplace for heat, or you can build furniture. But you can't do both. Okay, one or the other. And these 3 enzymes determine which way it's going to go. So if you're in growth mode, you grow. If you're in burning mode, you burn. And the 3 enzymes have to be in synchrony with each other in order to do that. What if those 3 enzymes are not in synchrony? What if they're off? What if they're not doing exactly what growth or burning would dictate? So basically you've got 3 enzymes, 2 valences, high-low, or on-off. That means you have 2 to the 3 permutations. You have 8 permutations. One of them is growth, one of them is burning. That means there's 6 more. Every one of those is a chronic disease. It is the dysynchrony of those 3 enzymes that lead to the chronic disease. And so the question is, what did that? And the answer is, that's our environment. That's our nutrition. Turning those on or off. And it turns out those 3 enzymes are all kinases. They're all phosphorylatable. So that's what a kinase is. You get phosphate put on it, and it changes the enzyme, changes the activity. Okay? So kinase can turn on, can turn off based on its phosphorylation status. Well, what determines the phosphorylation status? The metabolic status inside the cell. Reactive oxygen species, which your mitochondria make. So when your mitochondria make ROSs, it tells those 3 enzymes to go one way and not the other way. So everything is in concert as long as those three enzymes are doing what they're supposed to all at the same time. When they fall out of synchrony, that's when you end up with disease. And those are determined by what the mitochondria is doing. Fix the mitochondria, fix the whole thing.
I had asked about insulin and its contribution to the chronic diseases. Connect that piece with what you just said.
Well, so when your mitochondria are not working, the insulin is going to basically have to go up in order to divert the glucose away from the mitochondria, the pyruvate away from the mitochondria, to go to something else. So the pyruvate can be used in the Randle cycle to make proteins, or it can be used in the de novo lipogenesis to make lipids, or it can be used in the pentose phosphate shunt to make ribose for DNA. Okay, so you can grow the cell. You can grow the cell so it can divide. Okay, now you don't want the cell to divide if you're supposed to be in burning mode. That's what happens in your coronary arteries. You get coronary artery, smooth vascular muscular growth. That's what makes the coronary artery that much thicker and stiffer. And then it's a lot easier for a plug, for a thrombus to come, plug it up, and now you have a heart attack. Okay. In addition, that insulin's a growth factor, and so when the insulin goes up, it causes glands to grow. And when glands grow, much more chance for a tumor to develop. So there's your breast cancer. Okay? And insulin causes diversion of energy in the brain away from neurons because the insulin receptors are on astrocytes. Okay, and so they end up storing glycogen, and when they store glycogen, that starts the phospho-tau thing, and that's been associated with Alzheimer's. So the more insulin, the more growth, and the more growth, when it's not supposed to grow, the more risk for disease.
In this whole thesis of too many carbs, too much sugar, raising the insulin, there's a double-edged sword here. We just talked about the insulin piece and the damage it can cause, but elevated blood glucose can cause small vessel damage as well. Bring that piece in.
So glucose is like grains of sand. Okay, the higher your blood glucose goes, the more grains of sand you got. Okay, now if you only have a couple of grains of sand, and you've got liquid going, no big deal. Okay, but if you have a lot of grains of sand and you have liquid going, it might actually damage the inside of your vasculature. So high glucose causes dysfunction of the internal vasculature, especially small vessels. So it causes microvascular disease, causes retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, problems in the eye, problems in the nerve, problems in the kidney. So high blood glucose, due to, say, type 1 diabetes, will take its toll, irrespective of insulin or not. But high blood insulin will cause macrovascular disease because of that growth that we just talked about, irrespective of the glucose. So they do two different things to the vasculature, and they're both bad, but they're different. So the high blood glucose causes small vessel disease. The high blood insulin causes large vessel disease. And usually end up with both, because that's what diabetes is high blood glucose and high blood insulin. So you end up with both. So there's type 2 diabetes for you. I've always found interesting as a pediatrician, we always had type 1 diabetes. That was always in our portfolio. But now we have type 2 diabetes too, which we never had. When I entered medical school, type 2 diabetes in children was unheard of. It was reportable. Now it's 1/3 of all patients. Okay? And it happened on my watch. And so when I learned diabetes, I learned type 1. And what we learned was that it took years and years and years of high blood glucose to effectuate that microvascular disease problem. But what was interesting was when type 2 diabetes came around, we could see patients in clinic, pediatric patients, adolescents, who didn't have diabetes yet, but they had high blood insulin. They had insulin resistance. They were obese, but they were not diabetic. They had normal blood glucoses. They had normal glucose tolerance. So it wasn't from hyperglycemia, but they already had albumin in their urine. They had microalbuminuria. They already had the kidney manifestation of insulin acting on the kidney. And they were adolescents, not 40 years later. They were already kids. They were just kids. And they already had signs of insulin damage. So people think diabetes is because of high blood glucose. They think that all the damage is due to the high blood glucose. That is wrong. That is a mistake. That's because they didn't live through it like I did. In fact, in 2008, the group at Joslin, Sudha Bittinger was the first author, but this was in Ron Kahn's lab, developed my favorite mouse in the whole world. I love this friggin' mouse. Best mouse ever, okay? This mouse basically sends everybody back to medical school because it is so paradoxical. It is so out of line with everything we learn in medical school. And it's true. And, it's because what we teach in medical school is wrong. Okay. And this is the mouse that proves that they're wrong. Okay. This mouse is called the Podirko mouse, Podirko. What is it? It is the insulin receptor has been lifted genetically out of the kidney of this mouse. Okay. The rest of the mouse is perfectly fine. Wild type mouse everywhere except the kidney. No insulin receptor in the kidney. So this animal has normal glucose tolerance because the beta cells work fine. This animal has normal liver because the liver works fine. This animal has normal brain because the brain works fine. But this animal has the worst diabetic nephropathy, worst diabetic kidney disease of any animal model on the planet. Normal blood glucose, worst diabetic nephropathy. If glucose is the cause of the kidney disease, how does this animal that has normal glucose have the worst kidney disease? That's why everyone has to go back to medical school to figure that out. Okay? And the answer is because it's not the glucose that caused the damage. It's the insulin. So these animals have normal insulin, but the insulin's not working at the kidney. And so they end up with diabetic nephropathy. They end up with diabetic kidney disease. That's telling us that it's the insulin that's the problem. And that's why these adolescents who don't have diabetes yet have microalbuminuria, which is the first sign of the transition to metabolic syndrome, to diabetic kidney disease, even with normal glucose. So insulin is the bad guy. I can't say it any simpler than that. Yes, glucose is bad too. I'm not saying it's not. Insulin's worse.
Hence why I opened up with that, and we've been focusing on it.
Well, insulin's a good thing to focus on.
What's the youngest you've seen somebody acquire type 2 diabetes? And the reason I ask that is because in our world, it's common knowledge that insulin resistance can go on in the background for a decade or even more.
Oh, yeah.
Before somebody becomes type 2 diabetic. So I would assume in kids, it would still take a period of time before they get to that point. So what's the youngest you see?
Age 5.
Wow.
I've seen a 5-year-old type 2 diabetic.
Crazy.
Yeah. Now, there are genetic forms of type 2 diabetes, which are, even earlier. Like, for instance, Rabson-Mendenhall and leprechaunism. Okay. They have genetic defects in the insulin receptor. So they have basically, insulin receptor deficiency to start with. They're like the pedicle mouse many times over because it's in every organ. Okay. And you find those out like in the normal newborn nursery because they're sick as hell and their blood glucose ends up in the hundreds. And when you measure their insulin, it's also in the thousands. Okay. But the insulin, because there's no receptor to bind to, can't bring the glucose down. And those babies, the leprechauns especially, they die by age 1. Okay. Nothing can save them. Okay. We haven't figured out how to fix those babies yet. I took care of those babies, as a pediatric endocrinologist. They're rare, but they come, I would say probably 1 every 5 years. So I've taken care of like 3 of them. Okay. They're always disasters. But that's not what's happening in most people. Most people, it's insulin resistance occurring not because of a genetic defect, but because of some functional defect. And that functional defect is usually mitochondrial dysfunction.
Okay, so insulin's the bad guy today. We mentioned the fact that this can go on in the background for over a decade, causing disease silently in the background. Given that, what are some symptoms people can look to without going to the doctor to realize if they're in that period of, say, 10, 15 years where things are a shit show behind the scenes? And then objectively, when they go see their doctor, what testing can they have done to see where they're at on the spectrum?
Right. So the question is, how do you diagnose high insulin? And the answer is by lab tests. But are there signs or symptoms that will tell you that? And the answer is, yeah, there are a few. Okay. So the first, of course, is increasing waist circumference. That'll tell you you're insulin resistant. Okay. The second is insulin doesn't just bind to the insulin receptor. Insulin also binds to the epidermal growth factor receptor, the EGF receptor. And this is on your skin, and it's particularly prevalent on extensor surfaces of the skin. So like your knuckles or the back of your neck or behind your knees or in the cleavage areas like under your bra strap, okay, or under the mammary gland. Okay. And what will happen is it will thicken it up. Okay. Look like sort of like alligator skin. Okay. And often it'll change color. It's particularly noticeable in African Americans. Okay. And so this has a name. It's called acanthosis nigricans. Acanthosis. When I was a med student in 1976, Robin's pathology textbook had 1 sentence on acanthosis nigricans. Okay, it was rare. I never saw it in pediatrics all through my residency. And now every kid in America has it, if you know where to look. And so what that's telling you is that the insulin level in the blood is high, because that's a manifestation of insulin binding to this epidermal growth factor receptor on the skin. So when you see that, you don't even have to draw the blood. You already know you got a problem. And I would point this out to parents in clinic. I would say to the mom, Mom, come over here. Look at the back of the neck. Okay. What do you see? Oh, rash. It's not a rash. Okay. Okay. Or ring around the collar. A lot of them think it's ring around the collar. I say, have you ever tried to wash it off? And they say, yeah, it doesn't come off. I said, right, it doesn't come off. And so then I would go to the computer and I would type in acanthosis nigricans. And so all the images would come up. I say, does that look like yours, kid? Oh, yeah. Okay. So I explained to them, this is extra insulin working on the skin. This is a sign of high insulin. So I don't even have to draw your kid's blood, and I already know what the problem here is. Okay. And here's the problem, lady. Okay. Your kid eats, insulin's high, straight to fat. Your kid eats, insulin high, straight to fat. Kid grows bigger until finally kid gets so huge, so gargantuan, so enormous that your pancreas, which makes the insulin in your abdomen, can't even make enough for as big as your kid will have gotten. Your kid will have outgrown its insulin supply. And when that day comes, there won't be enough insulin to fat. Then the blood sugar stays in the blood, starts to rise, and now you got type 2 diabetes. That's where this is headed. So she goes, oh my God, that's terrible. I go, yes, it is. But the good news is you're here, and we could do something about it if you choose to. Of course I want to choose to, right? I say, well, the only thing we can do is get the insulin down. Get the insulin down. And the mom say, well, how do you do that? I go, best way, don't let it go up. So what makes it go up? Of course she doesn't know. I go, 2 things, refined carbohydrate and sugar. That's what makes insulin go up, which is true, by the way. Oh, branched chain amino acids also make it go up, but that's a little too much for them at that point. But that's basically how we handled all these patients. Basically explaining to them the clinical manifestations that we could show them, linked to the pathophysiologic process, linked to interventions that we know are successful. And when they see it on their own kid's neck, and they see that it's a thing on the computer, okay, it goes away, the belief system aspect of it goes away, and they start understanding that they have to start taking in factual information, and that they actually have to do something lifestyle-wise to change their to change their kids' trajectory in terms of metabolic risk. And I would say 50, based on our clinic data, 50% of the time, that was enough. It wasn't always enough, but it was enough a lot.
For an adult that's noticing they have a lot of belly fat, they're figuring they're on this continuum we've been talking about of insulin resistance, they come to see you. What's the full panel of objective tests you do on them to see where they're at?
We do a bunch of tests, but the best tests are the most expensive, and we don't usually do those. And some of them are research, only, so we don't do those. So what do we do? When they come in, what labs do we draw? Okay, basically, here's what we draw. Draw fasting insulin. We draw a hemoglobin A1C, but that's the last thing to change. We draw fasting glucose, but that's even later to change. Okay, we draw a lipid panel, and specifically we're looking at ApoB and triglycerides, and we also draw an ALT, alanine aminotransferase, because that tells us about liver fat. That's sort of the basics. That's the basic package of the lab tests that we draw. Oh, I forgot. We also draw uric acid. And the reason for that is because sugar makes uric acid go up, and uric acid increases risk for hypertension and gout. So we basically, do cheap, simple tests that are easily available that insurance will cover. And that gives us, I would say, 90% of what we need to know. Now, is there more to do? Sure. But in general, that's enough. We can get in the weeds on what the other stuff is. But, in general, that's what we can do, and that's what insurance will cover.
Let's come back to fructose. We mentioned it was one of the 3 culprits when it comes to liver fat, along with branched chain amino acids and alcohol. Let's talk about physiology of fructose entering the body, the liver, and beyond.
You consume fructose. Okay, first thing is something sweet hits the tongue. Message goes tongue to brain. Sugar's coming. Message goes brain to pancreas. Sugar's coming. Release the insulin. Now, if that's something sweet turned out not to be fructose, but to be, say, an artificial diet sweetener, you still get the message, release the insulin. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay. Sweet alone generates the insulin, part of the insulin response. Now, the rise in the blood glucose will be the rest of the insulin response, but the sweet alone will have primed the beta cell to release insulin. So you get that even before the food gets to your stomach. And we can prove that because there's a phenomenon called the cephalic phase of insulin secretion. You take a patient, you admit him to the hospital overnight. They wake up in the morning, they're fasting. Their blood glucose is 70, everything's fine, right? You bring a tray of food into the room and you let them look at it. You let them smell it, but you don't let them eat it. Got it? And then you take the tray out of the room. What happens to the blood glucose? Nothing, because they didn't eat anything. What happens to the blood insulin? It went up. The more obese, the higher it went up. But the insulin went up, not because the glucose changed, not because they ate anything, not because there were calories to work on. The insulin went up because the brain thought the food was coming. Cephalic phase of insulin secretion, well known, dates back, to the 1970s. A guy at University of Indiana by the name of Terry Powley did this work, way back when. Okay, I actually worked on a disorder of that brain to pancreas connection called hypothalamic obesity. That's how I got into the obesity business in the first place. Kids with brain tumors that basically destroyed that area of the brain that controls energy, metabolism, energy balance, and food intake. And so these kids would become massively obese after their brain tumor. And I was at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, and I was charged with figuring out how to help them. Okay, 350, 400 pounds. Okay, these were kids who were normal weight and height until their brain tumor. And then all hell broke loose. And I had to figure out what to do for them. And what we did was we gave them a drug that suppressed insulin release, because we postulated that their problem was that their brain thought they were starving because that area of the brain was dead. And so their vagus nerve, which was telling the pancreas what to do, was telling it, generate more insulin because we can't see the leptin level. We can't see that, that energy balance is normal. We think the patient is starving, therefore release more insulin. And so the insulin levels would go sky high, and that would drive everything into fat. But we couldn't fix that because the brain was, that area of the brain was dead. So what we did was we basically stopped the pancreas from making extra insulin. And lo and behold, they started losing weight. But even more importantly, they started exercising spontaneously. These were kids who sat on the couch, ate Doritos, and slept. And now, because we got their insulin down, they had energy to burn instead of to store. And so they started being much more active. And the parents would say, "Oh my God, I got my kid back." And the kids would say, "This is the first time my head hasn't been in the clouds since the tumor." We reversed their metabolic mayhem by getting their insulin down. And that's just at the level of the tongue. Okay, so now the fructose goes further down, gets into the stomach. Okay, it doesn't do anything in the stomach, but then goes into the duodenum. And then the question is, what happens to it there? And several things happen to it there. The first is that your intestinal cells can actually turn fructose into fat. Intestinal de novo lipogenesis. And so about 10% of the fructose load will get turned into fat in the intestine right away and get absorbed through the lacteals and into the lymphatic system and come out. And they're chylomicrons, and they get circulated and they go to the liver and they get cleared. Just 10% of the fructose load. But that leaves 90% of the fructose load still there. And what happens then? So there's an enzyme in the intestine, and it's called TXNIP, thyrodoxin inhibitory protein. Thyrodoxin inhibitory protein. And this enzyme basically ratchets up the ability to absorb fructose. So if you've never seen fructose and you get a big bolus, you don't absorb it. And the reason is because you haven't activated this enzyme yet. And so you end up with bad diarrhea. And pretty much anybody who goes crazy on Halloween knows about bad diarrhea. It's because they hadn't activated enough of their TXNIP. Okay? But if you had Halloween every day, then you wouldn't get diarrhea. You'd get fat instead. And it's because you ratcheted up your TXNIP. This is work from Richard Lee at Harvard, of this whole TXNIP thing. Okay. That increases fructose absorption at the level of the intestine. And then that fructose goes to the liver. And the GLUT5 transporter in the liver will suck that fructose out of the portal system to a point. There's a limit to how well that GLUT5 transporter will work. If you over stimulate, if you basically, drink a 20-ounce Coke, which has way too much fructose for that GLUT5 transporter, then the liver will grab what it can, but it can't grab enough. And so you will end up with a serum fructose level that will be present in the peripheral circulation. So normally your fructose level in your blood is 0 because it doesn't make it past your liver. It goes intestine to liver and goes, and that's it. But if you overwhelm your liver's capacity, then you will end up with a fructose level. So what happens if you do that and you drink that 20-ounce Coke? Turns out there are fructose receptors on beta cells, and that makes them secrete more insulin because they have to clear it. And that's like a real disaster because now you've got everything going wrong. But what happens in the liver to the 85% or so that gets cleared by the GLUT5 transporter? It goes into the cell. Fructose gets converted to fructose 1-phosphate by the enzyme fructokinase. And fructose 1-phosphate then gets chopped up into 3 carbon fragments, and then they get turned into pyruvate at the level of the mitochondria. They do not get turned into glycogen. So fructose does not go to glycogen. Glucose does go to glycogen. Fructose does not go to glycogen. Fructose goes to the mitochondria. And that's one of the reasons why the mitochondria get overwhelmed, because there's too much pyruvate at the level of the mitochondria for the mitochondria to handle because there was too much fructose coming into the cell in the first place. And so that's when the mitochondria go, don't do that, and send that pyruvate off to become citrate, then acetyl-CoA, and then that acetyl-CoA becomes malonyl-CoA, and the malonyl-CoA then gets turned, added 2 carbon fragments at a time, and you end up with fatty acids. That's how you end up with triglyceride. That's how the fructose becomes triglyceride. It goes to pyruvate first, then tries to enter the mitochondria, can't, gets thrown off as citrate. The citrate becomes acetyl-CoA, then malonyl-CoA, and then fatty acids. Then those fatty acids get packaged with like the microsomal transfer protein, and now you have a VLDL. Now you have a triglyceride molecule. And that triglyceride molecule can leave the liver and increase your serum triglycerides and serve as a substrate for either obesity or cardiovascular disease, or that triglyceride molecule won't make it out of the liver at all and will precipitate as a lipid droplet, and now you have fatty liver disease. And when you have fatty liver disease, that generates the insulin resistance. And now your pancreas is going to make more insulin to make the liver do its job. So you've got the high insulin, you've got the fatty liver, and you have the metabolic mayhem.
Let's come back to the leptin piece, make sure we all understand that. let's first talk about in a normal, healthy body, how that works, and then how insulin blocks leptin and how that works in the brain for somebody that's insulin resistant.
So this is actually work I did. I'm published in this quite a while ago. So there's this hormone, leptin. We discovered leptin in 1994. Okay. And what leptin does is it's a signal from the fat cell to the brain. Hey, I have enough energy on board. I don't need to eat so much. I can also engage in expensive metabolic processes like puberty, pregnancy. Okay. No leptin, no puberty. No leptin, no pregnancy. Leptin's a permissive factor for using energy for expensive stuff that costs energy, because the leptin's telling the brain, I got it. Don't worry. I got your back. All right. Now, leptin deficiency, therefore, is read by the brain as starvation. But these people aren't starving. They're fat. Why do they keep gaining weight? If leptin tells your brain you have enough, why doesn't it stop you? It should, but it's not. Something's broken with the negative feedback. The servo mechanism's not working because the leptin's not telling the brain what's going on. That's called leptin resistance. So there's leptin deficiency, there's leptin resistance. Ultimately, the brain sees the same thing, not enough leptin. But leptin deficiency is a total of 14 people in the world. Leptin resistance is about 4 billion people. 14 people, 4 billion people. Which do you think you have? All right? 14 people, we can give them shots of leptin, and we're replacing the leptin that's missing. And that basically fixes the problem. But if you have leptin resistance, giving extra leptin is not going to do anything because you already got enough. It's just not working. You think it's going to work better from a bottle than it will be from your bloodstream? Forget about it. You got to fix the leptin resistance. So what causes the leptin resistance? And this is the research that I've done. We showed that insulin blocks leptin signaling in the brain. Insulin blocks leptin signaling. So the higher your insulin goes, the less well your brain sees leptin. Now, that is the cut in the servo mechanism. That's what basically turns a negative feedback into a positive feedback, that insulin blocks leptin. Now, here's the question of the ages. Why would God do that to us? What's in it for him, for this to have occurred as a standard phenomenon that only seems to create disease? That insulin should block leptin. And the answer is, we think, evolutionarily, thinking like God now. Okay. There are actually 2 times in your life when you actually have to gain weight. And they are puberty and pregnancy. If you don't gain weight during puberty, species dies out. If you don't gain weight during pregnancy, species dies out. So if your leptin worked right all the time, you could never gain the weight. And the species would die out. So doesn't it make sense that the same hormone that's driving the weight gain peripherally should be the same hormone that's blocking the leptin signaling to keep you eating centrally? That they would be yoked together so that insulin can tell the body and the brain, store and keep eating. Because if insulin didn't block that, then you'd store and you'd stop because the leptin would go up and that would reduce your food intake. And so you would never gain the weight. You would be the 97-pound weakling on the beach, never being able to bulk up, and therefore never being able to actually reproduce either. So insulin blocking leptin actually makes perfect evolutionary sense. And the reason is because we're only supposed to be insulin resistant during puberty, which, by the way, is a normal part of puberty, insulin resistance, and also during pregnancy. And insulin resistance is a normal part of pregnancy. The problem is we're insulin resistant 24/7, 365, not just during puberty and pregnancy. And why are we insulin resistant? Because our mitochondria is screwed. And why are mitochondria screwed? For all the reasons we've already discussed. The fructose, the alcohol, the branched chain amino acids, all the extra calories.
The good news in all this, all roads lead back to insulin. And it's a very straightforward process to bring that back down. You've already mentioned it.
That's not fair. It is not straightforward. If it was straightforward, it would be easy. It is not easy.
Okay, I'm not saying it's easy, but I do believe it's straightforward when people have the right information. We got to lower the sugars, get rid of them, and get rid of processed foods.
Ultra-processed foods, the bad guy.
I also want to talk about some of these foods that are in a gray area, especially for people that are metabolically unhealthy, like fruit. But the obvious first step is the two we started with there. Get rid of those, bring the blood glucose down, bring the insulin down, regain your leptin signaling, and prevent chronic disease and the conditions associated with the elevated blood sugar, like small vessel disease. So it all leads back to this, I'm going to call it a simple strategy, but people don't have the right information unless they're tuning into something like this.
Well, indeed. The bottom line is if you think a calorie is a calorie, you're screwed. It's that simple, because then you're just going to monitor calories. You're not going to be monitoring your carbohydrate. You're not going to be monitoring your fructose. You're going to say, well, carbohydrate and fructose, they're 4 calories per gram. Fat is 9 calories per gram. Therefore, if I'm trying to eat less calories, I should eat more carbohydrates and fructose and less fat. Wrong. But that's what we did for, basically 60 years. Is exactly that. And things only got worse. And that's why they got worse. Because we basically induced mitochondrial dysfunction. By the way, you know what mitochondria are made of?
Bacteria. Ancient bacteria.
Well, ancient bacteria, but what are they made of?
Fat?
Fat. That's right. They are fat. Okay? Mitochondria are fat. Okay? When you take mitochondria and you do a chemical analysis on, what the structural components of mitochondria, it's fatty acids. Okay? So the lower the fat that you're eating, the less well your mitochondria would work. Actually cause the insulin resistance. So, we got this all backwards in the, 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way up. And the reason is because we thought fat was the bad guy. Turns out fat is not the bad guy. Trans fats are the bad guy. No argument there. And trans fats were everywhere. And they just called those fat. Trans fats are basically poison. Okay, trans fats are not even metabolizable because you can't break the trans double bond. So you can't even turn them into energy. So, this concept of calories is useless. It's essentially garbage because calories come from bomb calorimeters. That's the measurements. We are not bomb calorimeters. Our mitochondria are not bomb calorimeters. They, depends on, what they're made of, depends on what comes in, depends on whether AMP kinase is activated or not, depends on, a whole bunch of things that have nothing to do with calories, but have to do with the, arbiters of metabolic health. And, all those previous investigators, in the past basically ignored all of that and basically led us down a primrose path to destruction. So insulin is the monitor. It's the arbiter of whether you've got a problem or not. Because when your insulin's low, that means your mitochondria are working, because you don't need to divert energy away from the mitochondria, because they can take what's coming in. The funnel is flowing. But when your insulin goes up, that means your mitochondria can't take it. So what do you need to do? You need to take the load off. Well, what's the load? Refined carbohydrate and sugar.
Insulin's the new calorie. Instead of bringing our calories down, let's bring insulin down.
That's what I've been saying for the last 18 years.
Oh, I guess I can't trademark that then.
No, afraid not. I can't even trademark it. But that's been my shtick, for a long time now, is get the insulin down any way you can. And it works, if you can do it. But you have to understand what causes it in order to be able to do it.
You brought up trans fats there. I want to go back and do a 101. When we have that double bond, it goes from cis to trans. Luckily now, banned in the food supply, but they can still sneak them in if they're under a certain limit. Where I want to focus, though, is on making them in the kitchen.
Yes.
That's where I want to go. So talk about what oils people are using or fats and how they can go about making them in the kitchen so they can avoid that.
Basically, any fat that you use for cooking can be a trans fat, except lard, except animal fat. Animal fat is triglyceride. Animal fat is saturated fat. Well, if it's saturated fat, then there's no double bond. If there's no double bond, there's no way to turn a cis fat into a trans fat. So basically, there are two kinds of fats. There's saturated and there's unsaturated. And there's polyunsaturated. But, ultimately, they're all in the same category. They have a double bond in them somewhere. Now, the double bonds are helpful in some cases because there are hormones and cytokines and factors in our body that need those unsaturated fatty acids to build specific inflammatory and or metabolic machinery. Okay. In addition, omega-3s, which are highly unsaturated, okay, help membrane fluidity and help neuronal transmission. Really important and necessary for your brain, to work right. Okay. So God knows we need unsaturated fatty acids. Saturated fatty acids, though, won't have no double bonds. So you can heat a saturated fatty acid to any level you want, and that will not turn into a trans fat because there's no double bond to flip. When you put enough heat across a double bond, it'll flip. It'll go from a cis to a trans, just like that. Okay? And virtually all of the fats that we cook in, because they're oils, pretty much anything that's an oil and not solid has double bonds. So then the question is, are there certain oils that are more likely to flip than others? And the answer is yes. The more double bonds that are in the fat, the more likely one of them will flip. And if they flip, they're flipping to become a trans fat. So the amount of heat you put across that double bond will dictate whether or not you're creating trans fats in your own cooker at home, in your own skillet. And that's a problem. And that's one of the reasons why smoke point became an issue. So what is the fat we cook in the most but has the lowest smoke point? Olive oil. Olive oil is terrific. Olive oil is wonderful. Olive oil solves a lot of problems except for one. You can't heat it high. Olive oil was not meant for frying. Olive oil was not meant for sauteing. Olive oil was meant to be used room temperature on a salad. Okay. And the minute you put heat across that double bond in olive oil, it's going to flip. So you can turn olive oil into a poison with enough heat. Okay. There are other the fatty acids that we use. There's, polyunsaturated fatty acids like canola oil. They'll turn into trans fats too. And they often have 2 double bonds instead of 1. Okay, omega-3s have 3 double bonds. You definitely don't want to heat omega-3s. In fact, you don't want to use omega-3s for energy at all. You want to use omega-3s for their neuronal stabilization properties. Okay, so you take those, as omega-3 pills or eat fish. Okay, but you don't necessarily want to, heat the hell out of them. Okay. Then there are medium chain triglycerides like coconut oil. Okay. And those are triglycerides. Those are saturated fat, but they're shorter. So they can be heated high. So that's why a lot of the paleo people use coconut oil, because you're not going to turn those into trans fats. Okay. The problem with medium chain triglycerides is they're absorbed a different way. They're absorbed through the portal vein, not through the lacteals and the lymphatics like we talked about. They don't get turned into the chylomicrons. They go straight to the liver. And so if your liver is having a problem, medium chain triglycerides will hit them hardest, fastest. And that can be a problem. So it's not like an automatic that medium chain triglycerides are good. Depends. Yes, no. Then you have omega-6s. Omega-6s are, what's in seed oils. And the problem with omega-6s is they are the precursors to arachidonic acid. And arachidonic acid is the precursor to thromboxanes, leukotrienes, and eicosanoids. Okay, and those are all of the things that are necessary for inflammation. So when you add a lot of omega-6s, you have an increased risk for inflammation. So we talk about omega-6 to omega-3 ratios. Bottom line is, if you're consuming too many omega-6s, you're setting yourself up for inflammatory response. In addition, omega-6s are usually what are used in frying. And so you get a lot of trans fats. So because those omega-6s, you can flip those double bonds. They have a higher smoking point, and they're cheaper, like soybean oil. Okay, and so you will use those in fryers, and that will increase the risk, and so of metabolic disease, because you've basically turned those omega-6s into trans fats. So number one, they're precursors to inflammatory cytokines, and number two, they can be easily flipped trans fat wise, and they're cheap, so we use them in fryers. So omega-6s tend to be problematic. And then, of course, trans fats themselves are, the absolute worst, because they're already bad. So different fats, different effects, different risks. Everything's different. So the food industry will tell you a carbohydrate's a carbohydrate, a sugar's a sugar, a calories a calorie, a fat is a fat, a protein is a protein. Garbage. Absolute trash. They tell you that to assuage their own culpability for what they're putting into the food supply. But you have to practically be a nutritional biochemist to figure this all out, which, of course, is why things are so screwed up.
Whether it be olive oil or one of the seed oils, like canola, are they ever heated in processing? And if so, wouldn't they have to mark trans fats on the label? I would assume those would be formed in processing, and then they'd have to label it. Explain that part.
They don't have to label it because they didn't start with trans fats, but they can make them. So there is a machine at your local ultra-processed food manufacturer, and it is called an extruder. Okay? It's what makes Cheetos. Do you ever wonder how you got from corn to Cheetos? That's how, in an extruder. And in order to force the stuff through to give it that puffy, cheesy flavor thing, and make these, long, things that look like, little orange poops. You have to force them through at high temperature through an extruder. And that extruder has such high temperatures that they can take the fat in the recipe, and because of the high heat, they can end up on the other end as trans fats. Because you didn't add them to start with, they don't have to report them at the end.
So if you look at the bag, it won't say whatever trans fats were acquired during processing.
Nope.
Wow, I didn't know that. What about oils like canola oil? Because I've heard they do some pretty crazy stuff processing those oils, including deodorizers, and go through a whole process.
So we don't know enough about what happens to those, and what it ultimately, whether it changes their character, and whether it changes their functionality, and whether it changes their metabolic risk. But yeah, I mean, you have to do a whole lot of things to all these oils to make them even palatable. I am not, unfortunately, an expert in that, so I don't know all the things that are done. What I do know is that what happens to food in your kitchen is possibly more dangerous than what happens to food at the food processor.
Question regarding the seed oils. If they're unheated, you're no expert on what they're doing in processing, but would you use them in your own kitchen without heating them? Things like canola oil.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm careful with them. I tend to use more olive oil and avocado oil and sesame oil and peanut oil. I would say those are my 4 go-to oils in general for preparing food and cooking.
There's people talking about a connection between the seed oils and insulin resistance. Have you ever seen that in the research?
Well, so the question is, what happened to the seed oils? Were they heated or what? There is a terrible movie going around on Vimeo or on the internet. It might be on YouTube too. And it's called The Big Lie. And it's all about seed oils. And it's basically 4 talking heads talking about seed oils. That seed oils are the devil incarnate. Okay. I think that spent seed oils, that is, seed oils heated up to ridiculously high levels, either because of sautéing or frying or extrusion. Okay. Those are terrible. But I'm not sure that an omega-6 fat at baseline is truly the bad guy. Okay. I think that, this requires a fair amount of nuance, and you sort of have to know what happened to the seed oil before it got to your mouth in order to be able to say anything. And that's not what this movie says. And so I'm a little worried that, this is misinformation, and I don't think it's disinformation. I think they're, the people who are in this movie are telling you what they know, but I don't think it's necessarily correct.
All right, let's come back to the practical here and get into a little bit more nuance before we wrap up. We've already been clear about sugars, refined carbs, ultra-processed carbohydrates. I mentioned things like fruit. For somebody that's
fine.
Okay, we'll get into the details here, but for somebody right now who is metabolically unhealthy, I know there's fiber, and I want to get your opinion there on how that protects the body. We've talked about it before, but let's talk about it again. And then for somebody that's healthy versus metabolically unhealthy, we've made it clear the processed carbs are out. For me, even the whole food carbs would be out in that case if somebody's metabolically unhealthy, but I'll have you share your thoughts.
Fiber is what we haven't talked about. I think fiber is the bee's knees when it comes to metabolic health. I think fiber is the answer to much of what's ailing us. And the problem is we're not consuming nearly enough. Why is fiber important? Because fiber is the food for the bacteria, food for the microbiome. Everyone's talking about microbiome dysfunction. That's right. I agree. Okay. The easiest way to get your microbiome to, behave is to feed it. Because if you don't feed your microbiome will feed on you. So, does fruit have fructose? Sure, very little, but it has some. But the fiber in the fruit made that fructose unabsorbable, and so the bacteria in your intestine got it, whereas you didn't. So the fiber is actually the antidote to the fructose. So that's why fruit is good, but juice is bad. Because once you strain out the fiber, then the intestine absorbs it just as fast as it would if it was a soda. So when you eat it whole, when you eat it with its fiber, that fructose basically is not for you. And that's why fruit is actually associated with reduction in type 2 diabetes, whereas fruit juice is associated with an increase in type 2 diabetes. The only difference between the fruit and the juice is the presence of fiber, because the fiber is what's actually mitigating the type 2 diabetes. So if you ate your fiber, and we have data on this, cardiovascular disease goes down, cancer goes down, diabetes goes down. So we need to eat more fiber. We need to eat more both soluble and insoluble fiber. Fruit, luckily, has both. Yes, it has a little bit of fructose. So what? Eat all the fruit you want. Just eat it whole. Don't put it in a smoothie machine. Don't juice it. And for God's sake, don't drink the fructose in a soda.
I know you got to go here, but we'll end on this. We've really hammered home the 2 categories of food we need to avoid. The other lever I think is important to mention is fasting.
Basically, I think that intermittent fasting is good for certain people. Okay, who are those people? And the answer is the people with liver fat. And the reason is because intermittent fasting gives your liver a chance to get rid of the fat it accumulated. So if your liver has fat in it, intermittent fasting is a good way to get rid of it. If you don't have liver fat, then intermittent fasting is basically neither here nor there. Neither good nor bad. So know what your liver's doing, and if your liver has fat in it, and you can find out from your physician, because you can look at your ALT, you can ultimately have a liver ultrasound or, MRI or worse, or, pancreatic, what's it called? FibroScan. There are ways to find out. But if your liver has fat in it, then you might consider intermittent fasting or a ketogenic diet in order to basically give the liver a chance to lose the fat it accumulated.
All right, Rob, we're going to end it there for today. I'm going to link up your website, your social media, your books, everything in the show notes. Really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome, Jesse. We went deep today.
Yeah, covered a lot of new stuff that I haven't heard you talk on. Thanks again.
All right, my pleasure.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
Ultimately, it's not what's in the food, it's what's been done to the food that matters. Everything fructose does to the mitochondria is designed to inhibit its functioning. It's metabolic health that drives